Good afternoon and welcome to this really important and special session, the cost of dying crisis, advice from those who know about funeral costs. My name is Cassius Francis. I'm a minister with the Wesleyan Holiness Church, and I've been working in this area, particularly around bereavement ministry, for a number of years, and really keen to be able to share with you some key pointers around this area of funeral costs. We've got a great lineup of speakers here for you this afternoon, and even though we are today recording on the 5th of July, you may be watching at a very different time, and that's fine. Because the information I know will be quality with the speakers that are going to be sharing with us today. So we have Greg Southall from Dudley Council, who is with us, Paul McLean from Integrity Funeral Care in London, Sharon Sinclair from Circle of Life Events, who is a funeral celebrant. Sophie Clarke will be hearing from shortly, from Down to Earth, and we also are hoping that Maxine Edgar will be joining us from BronzeAsh Funerals. So without further delay, I'd just like to introduce Sophie Clarke and ask her to share her presentation and some of the key work that they have been involved in through the Quaker Social Action. Thanks so much for joining us, Sophie.
Thank you very much for having me, Cassius. It's lovely to be here, and hopefully I can do justice to your introduction. So hello everyone, I'm Sophie. I am from Down to Earth, which is a project of Quaker Social Action. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully, all being well. There we go. So I'm one of the development workers here at Down to Earth, and I'm also the administrator for the Fair Funerals Pledge, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. I've been working for Down to Earth for almost 2 years, and our primary role at Down to Earth is to offer practical support to people who are struggling with funeral costs. And we operate across the UK, so England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And you can see our sort of key stats there. I'm not going to read them to you because you can see them nice and clearly on the screen there. As well as supporting people with funeral costs, we also share our insights and the voices of people that we support in our campaigns for change, because we believe that everyone should be able to afford a dignified funeral. And that's one of our sort of key aims is for that to become a possibility. So we are here today to talk about the cost of dying. The cost of dying crisis, and the first question that someone may ask is, what is the cost of dying? And effectively it's the total cost of a deceased person's send-off, including the professional fees for administrating their estate, the funeral service, and then optional extras like a reception or a wake following the funeral service. And shockingly, the average cost of dying in 2021 was £8,864, and that's from Sun Life's Cost of Dying Report 2022. That's quite shocking. It was quite shocking to me, and I've worked in the funeral profession, and I work for a funeral poverty project, and that figure is exceptionally high. So the funeral service section, which we're going to talk about sort of primarily today, is almost half of that cost of dying is for the funeral service. And those funeral costs and those funeral prices have actually more than doubled since 2004. For some reason my little clicker's not working. There we go. So the average cost of a basic cremation in the UK is now £3,765, and the average cost of a burial is £4,927. Again, those figures from Sun Life's Cost of Dying Report 2022. And as you can imagine, for someone on a low income or with limited or no savings, that can mean a financial crisis. And that's why funeral poverty is a crisis, and hence the cost of dying is a crisis. So to tell you a little bit about funeral poverty, there's three key factors behind the rise in funeral poverty. The first of which, the funeral industry is unregulated and prices vary dramatically between funeral directors. And I'll show you just how much they can vary in just a short time. Most bereaved people don't shop around. They're in a state of grief, of course. You know, but unfortunately that means that often people end up paying above the odds. And to top it off, existing government support for those who are eligible is inadequate and leaves people with a huge shortfall of money to find from other sources. Almost 1 in 6 people arranging a funeral have said that the cost caused them notable financial difficulty. And as well as the financial impact, there's the emotional impact, the psychological impact, and it has an impact on how people grieve and how they experience their bereavement. So I've mentioned the Fair Funerals Pledge, and that came about as a result of the Fair Funerals campaign, which began in 2014, and that was launched by Quaker Social Action, and it was pushing for national change around funeral costs, encouraging political engagement in funeral poverty issues, and this thankfully helped bring about an inquiry into funeral poverty in 2016. And the Works and Pensions Committee made recommendations on the back of that, including some radical reforms to the bereavement benefits, increasing the financial levels of the funeral payment scheme to cover the cost of a simple funeral. And finally, in 2020, there was an increase in the funeral payments that were available, and that was an increase of £300. It's still nowhere near enough. It's not rising with inflation. Social Security Scotland are a small step ahead. They are increasing their payments with inflation, but still not covering the cost of a simple funeral. Now, the campaign also called for a standardised pricing format for funeral costs, as well as UK-wide licensing for funeral directors, the establishment of a regulator for funeral directors, and the introduction of price caps. Now, we're not quite at price cap stage yet, but in 2021, in September, the Competition and Markets Authority made funeral price transparency a legal requirement. So 5 years after the recommendations were made, finally, this is happening. So we still argue that statutory regulation is needed and that price caps of some sort are needed. But this element of price transparency is a brilliant and amazing first step. So when you visit a funeral director's website, what you should see now is each of these items, a standardized price list, an additional options price list, their business terms, including payment arrangements, and a disclosure of their interests. And that's just on their website, and that standardized price list should be less than or equal to 1 click away from the homepage of the website, and should be displayed really clearly so that it's easy to find. And as well as being available on websites, that price list should also be displayed in their shop windows and within their branches as well. So that particular set of fees should be displayed really clearly and be easy to find. So I'm going to show you an example of a standardized price list. Some will look slightly different, but effectively they should all have the same list of provisions and prices for each of those. Now, there are a few things that we believe could be improved about this, which we are feeding back through the Competition and Markets Authority. The whole price that's displayed there relates just to adult funerals, so funerals for an adult. It's only intended to include dressing in a gown rather than a person's own clothes, although many funeral directors will enable a person to be dressed in their own clothes within that service. And it's only intended to include the staff required to move the coffin containing the deceased person on a wheeled bier. So, for example, at a crematorium, that could be as few as 3 people. The unattended funeral has no details. It is just an unattended funeral, so it's very unlikely to include the facility or availability for viewing the person in the funeral director's chapel of rest, if the family wanted that. Just going to go on to the next section of the standardised price list there, and also cost of doctors' fees for completion of cremation certificates is not listed, although there is a section just at the bottom there about the sort of to bring awareness to the need for doctors' fees. Although we are in touch with the CMA, it does need updating. There's now only 1 doctor required. So that gives you a really good idea of what you can find easily on funeral directors' websites and in their branch windows as well. Now, just in case you're all getting bogged down with PowerPoint slides, I'm going to stop sharing there for a minute. We are at Down to Earth currently conducting research into client vulnerability in the funeral sector, and that's to identify what action we can take as a charity to help recently bereaved people, ensure they're as supported as possible when making funeral arrangements. And primarily we're focusing on financial vulnerability and circumstances where people will be struggling to afford funeral costs. So it's something that we're really passionate about, helping people who are in that position. And when we work with our clients here at Down to Earth, we take quite a strategic approach. We work with them to work out what funds are available, firstly from the deceased estate and from areas like occupational pensions that may have some funds available, sometimes unions as well. And then we look at what the funds may be able to be accessed from, for example, the Department for Work and Pensions or Social Security Scotland. And then finally, because we know those bereavement benefits from the DWP and Social Security Scotland don't cover the full cost of a simple funeral, we then look towards charities for any shortfall there. And we can often help people to access funds from different charities across the UK and related to different things like occupation, sometimes religion, and different things like that. And that gives us a really good indication of what funds can be available for a funeral service, and then in turn helps people to be mindful about the arrangements that they're making in terms of the cost of different elements, and therefore hopefully be able to afford a dignified funeral for the person that's died. So I'm going to share my screen again, if I can remember where the button is. There it is. One of our key things that we advise people on is keeping funeral costs down. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to show how much of an impact shopping around could have. So comparing prices between funeral directors, I've known comparing funeral directors' prices, just taking a few minutes looking at their prices or ringing up the funeral directors to get a quote can save over £1,000. And those funeral directors there that I've got listed are funeral directors in the East London area, and you can very quickly see this is just the fees from their standardised price list. So it's for the identical set of core services, and you can see the difference in price there even just between, for example, James Hawes and Good Child as the most expensive there, and the second most expensive, W.G. Miller, you could easily save £600 to £700 just by comparing those costs there, and then cooperative in this instance were the cheapest option in the area that I was looking at. Obviously, different funeral directors do have a different approach to things. You'll be given services at some funeral directors that you're not at others. So it's important to shop around for what you want as well. But if you're looking primarily at cost, it can make a huge, huge difference. And having all of that information available means that people can make an informed decision and help them encounter less financial difficulties. Now, in some instances, becoming rarer for us, thankfully, we do help people to access public health funerals, which are arranged by local authorities when there's no one else who is able or willing to make funeral arrangements. Now, the provision of those services does vary significantly between different local authorities, and there is some government good practice guidance, but it is only guidance, so it's not a requirement. So many local authorities do default to cremation unless there is clear evidence to show that the deceased person would not have wanted cremation, and often they'll insist on that being in writing. So one of the reasons to sort of think ahead if possible, and sort of plan in advance, even if you're not able to sort of pay in advance, just having that piece of knowledge there can be really helpful to those who are then looking at making your funeral arrangements. Some local authorities don't allow anyone to attend and don't have any kind of ceremony, and some won't even return cremated remains in the event of a cremation. In the event of a burial, often the graves used are shared grave, or also known as a public grave. And most importantly, the local authority, as part of what they do seek to recover their costs from the deceased person's estate. Much of the news that's around about public health funerals is primarily around, look how much this local authority have spent on people's funerals this year. And so you can appreciate it's important where possible for them to recover their costs, but if there is no money, they do have a legal duty to step in when no one's able or willing to. Now, I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to leave you with a little story about why Down to Earth is so important to me, and why what I do is such a passion of mine. Before I started working at Down to Earth, I was a funeral director, and I had two families come in to see me one day to make funeral arrangements for their relatives. The first family came in to make funeral arrangements for their dad. Money was no object. The account before they left was over £11,000, paid in full, and we hadn't had decisions on sort of finer details at that point, so that account was going to go up. The next family that came in was a gentleman. He had two young children and an older child who needed ongoing support, and his wife had died from cancer at home. He had 76p in his bank account, and he wanted to arrange a direct cremation because it was the cheapest option, and he couldn't even afford that. The company I worked for required full payment before the funeral. All he wanted were his wife's ashes back as soon as possible. So he didn't end up making the arrangements with us. He went with another funeral director who had more flexibility on their payment terms, and I can't blame him at all. But he couldn't afford to attend his wife's funeral, to allow his kids to attend his wife's funeral. And that absolutely devastated me, that although he was eligible for the funeral expenses payment, it's so inadequate that he couldn't have any kind of ceremony or service for his wife. So I'm going to leave you with that and hand over to my lovely colleagues who are here to talk about their kind of key advice, and I'm sure that there'll be a little bit of reiterating of a couple of things that I've said, particularly about shopping around, because of how important it is. So I'm going to hand back to you, Cassius, to direct to the next person.
Sophie, thank you so much. And those stories that you highlighted at the end, I think really crystallize and hit home the real desperation that people must feel if they're not able to give their loved one the send-off that they would like, and are struggling alongside the grief with all of the other financial arrangements as well. So thank you for sharing. I know that I wanted to encourage people to know where to get further sources of information. I just Googled QSA, down to earth, and Sophie's details came up. So if you would like further information, please do the same, Googling QSA, down to earth. Okay, I'm gonna check that my lovely colleague Maxine is ready and able just to share with us. Hi Maxine, thanks for joining us.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, and appreciate that it's a busy time for you and for all of our colleagues this afternoon, so really appreciate you joining us. I was saying before you joined, Maxine, that actually you're the reason why we're all here listening to Sophie and to other colleagues this afternoon, because when we talked back in February and did the webinar, you reiterated the importance of doing something more around funeral costs. And so just wanted to firstly thank you for flagging it up as an issue for us to look at. I think the facts that Sophie has raised for us have really kind of made it clear why it's important for us to look at this issue. But I just wonder, for those who don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and the work that you're involved in, and maybe why it was that you felt it was important for us to focus on this issue around the costs of dying crisis.
Okay. All right, Rev. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity yet again to speak on funerals. And hello, everyone. Those that I know and those that I don't know. I know Sophie in terms of work. I can call her a colleague. We speak quite often and in depth. So it's actually wonderful to see you, Sophie. And Mr. Paul McLean, I've never actually met you, but it's wonderful to see you. I can't see you now, actually, because you're not on my screen. But everyone else, hello, good afternoon, and Reverend Cassius, we're mates. I have never pulled on a wig so quickly. I don't know why, but I had it in my diary for Saturday the 9th. And then I got this message, Maxine, will you be joining us today? And I thought, joining you for what? I'm cleaning my bedroom. And then I've realised I'm recovering from COVID. I've never had it before. So I'm in turmoil. So today I thought I've got to sort things out. But yes, we are here. And so I've listened to Sophie, and I agree and understand with everything that you've noted. I think one of the problems that we do have is that we have two systems. We have your corporates and we have your independents. That's one of the problems. And what we also fail to have within the can I say professional industry is transparency. Yeah, funeral directors on a whole lack transparency, and it's a business. Yeah, it's a business, sadly, and people are there to make money out of debt. Let's just be honest. Yeah, but we can apply ourselves differently. And I actually have a passion. I have a passion for the living and for the dead. That's just my strapline. A passion for the living and for the dead. And it's important to me that people are given a choice, and we are transparent with our families. So as well as we're talking about the standardized price list that has come on, which is seen as some kind of regulator, I mean, it's actually null and void. You know, we can shop around, Sophie, and we can look at all the different sites. Then we can sit down and we can talk to our funeral directors, and we can put pen to paper. And what we see on the websites are actually very different from what we're presented with. You know, one I think Paul will tell you possibly in more detail, markups on coffins, for instance. Hidden figures, they'll give you one figure. They'll say that their fee's probably $1,850. They'll probably put another 1,000 on the coffin. It totally depends on the individual. This is not for all. There are some of us that actually don't mark up on items. We charge a set fee. So if I pay £500 for a coffin, that's what my client pays. My florist, if I pay £25 a letter, that's what my client pays. But that is my choice. Yeah, I'm there to provide a service, to be fair to my families, to offer transparency, yeah, but also to make a profit. And my profit will come from my set fee. I'm a small independent. I've got shop, I've got premises. My outgoings are not fantastically huge. At this juncture, I can afford to do that. Concerns like cribs and so forth, they have massive outgoings, and therefore they have to, you know, their prices are highly inflated. I think what we need to be offering, I think regulation is really important. Regulation is really, really important, because when you, not necessarily in terms of having a piece of paper that says that I can do the job, but in terms of being under a governing body that says this is how you have to apply yourself, this is how you have to present your figures. I think that's what's important, because I've had people come into my shop, and I mean, they've turned me down, gone elsewhere, come in and sat in front of me, and my fees have been like £2,500 less. You know, when Sophie made reference to £1,000, I thought, well, possibly a bit more, £2,500 less, because I can do that. I have the flexibility. I make the decisions, you know, and I also have the ability to look at the individual clients and know what they can and what they can't afford. And that's just through being honest and asking questions, because the reality is, I had a friend call me last week, and she said, I'm upping my prices as a celebrant, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to be flexible on the DWP claimants, the funeral grant. When in effect, the people, many of my clients, and a vast majority, have the funeral grant, and also we use Down to Earth and QSA. They have more money than those that are working and not in receipts of the grant. So it swings and roundabouts. But if they meet the criteria on paper, who am I to argue with that? So it's really, really messy, and it needs strategic planning. And at the same time, we need to be fair. We need to be fair. And I think quite often the days, you know, the days of funeral directors monopolising or taking advantage of those in grief, I think they're actually coming to an end. People are having more of a hands-on approach. People are choosing to buy their own coffin. They're choosing to take their own ceremonies. You know, that they're choosing to collect their debts. With this new wave of funeral director that we have at the moment, initiated by women, might I add, poetic endings and poppies and so forth. People are being empowered to actually go back to the days of looking after the dead themselves. So there is less need. Some communities will always rely on funeral directors, but I'm finding there's more of a trend. More and more people are having their hands on, running around and doing things themselves. And when I present them with information, they're coming back to me and they're saying, oh, well, actually, we looked here and this is what we've seen. And I don't know if that's a generational thing whereby we have younger people making decisions, people who are more, you know, on, how can I say, more savvy with social media and getting online and finding out things, as opposed to the generation that I knew as my parents, whoever came and said they were the funeral director, you just took what they said and you got on with it. But now I have a generation of people that are presenting me with information, and we'd like to do it this way, we'd like to do it that way. And we've seen it cheaper elsewhere. So that's one of the changes. I can't say it's a challenge because you just have to work with it. But that's one of the changes that I've identified.
Maxine, yeah, I think there is something about choice that we're having to appreciate and come to terms with now, even from my point of view as a Christian minister, recognizing that, you know, there is a whole spectrum of choices that people can make and will make. That is, as you say, I think perhaps a generational issue. I want to come back to you a little bit later, but I also want to give our other colleagues just an opportunity to join in. Thank you for sharing at short notice and for getting the Wigan on in time. I appreciate that. I'm going to come to Greg, a good friend from Dudley Council. Greg, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you reflect on what you've heard with the work that you do in Dudley.
Hi Cassius, thank you very much. So I'm Greg and I work for Dudley Council Public Health and Wellbeing. So I've got a few areas of work, but one of them focuses around bereavement. Some of the things we're looking at in Dudley Council around bereavement, we're looking to try and make our community more kind and compassionate to people who are grieving. We're looking to try and encourage people to have more conversations around death and dying so that loved ones aren't left in the unknown, not aware of what people's wishes were, and not left with kind of challenging financial situations potentially. And we're also looking at trying to reduce the loneliness of people. So when they have suffered a bereavement and they may have lost the significant people in their lives, that they're not so isolated from communities. So funeral costs fit into our area of planning and communicating what your wishes would be. So we're not leaving our loved ones in the unknown. So it's really important, as I say, to plan and communicate. So when it comes to your funeral wishes, it's really key to plan, research what you'd like. There are plenty of resources out there at the moment. So there's a beautiful little leaflet online that can be found from Dying Matters. It's My Funeral Wishes, and it's a simple little checklist where it may give you ideas on what you may like. It'll help you record your thoughts and wishes. It'll allow you to say where you would like your funeral, how you'd like people to be dressed, who you'd like to attend. All these little nuances are quite important. So when we do eventually die, our loved ones will feel comfort in knowing that actually our wishes have been upheld if possible. Now, by using resources such as the internet, the Dying Matters My Funeral Wishes list, we can plan, think about really what we'd like. So you get loads of different ideas. You know, things might trigger thoughts. You know, it might be that we've all been to traditional funerals, so we've not seen anything different done. But by being able to use the internet, we can see that actually, you know, we can lead our own service potentially. We can have different types of music on. People don't have to be dressed in somber clothes. Loads of different ideas. Okay, you don't have to have a traditional coffin, but these are things that we might not originally know. So it's great to have a look and investigate this. And then once we've investigated it, record it. So you might have that My Funeral Wishes checklist, or you might write it down. Once we've made those decisions, it's important to use, as Sophie mentioned earlier, funeral directors should be displaying their costs clearly online and in their shop windows. So you can cost out what you would like, so you understand how much your funeral would cost. You could make it cheaper or more expensive depending on your financial resources. One of the important things to remember is though, those prices are today's prices. So you know, with costs, they can go up and they can go down. So that's one key thing to remember. Once you've recorded all your wishes, it's really important to discuss it with those loved ones, so everybody knows actually what you would like. So make sure you write it down, make sure you tell people, and even discuss it so people are comfortable. If you're going for something more simple or something slightly different, so that they are aware of that. And finally, I'd just like to note that fortunately in Dudley, the public health funerals do allow people to attend, and they do return the remains. So at least that's one slight positive from Sophie's conversation earlier. Is there anything else you'd like me to add, Cassius, at all?
No, that's really helpful, Greg. I appreciate that issue again reiterated about choices that people can make and the range of choices that are available. Excuse me. And as you said, those choices can either increase or decrease costs. I know that our next speaker, Sharon Sinclair from Circle of Life Events, is particularly keen on looking at areas where we can think about reducing the costs of funerals. So thank you just for opening that area up for us, Greg. And I know that there's, again, a lot that you've done through your work with the council just for people to have access to resources. So I don't know if you're able to post a link in the chat so that people are aware of where they could find further information, if that's okay.
Yeah,
and
I'll do that.
Thank you. And I'll hand over to Sharon in the meantime. Sharon, can you, just tell us a bit about your own experience, what you've heard so far, but also what your feelings are around why where people should look for reducing costs as far as possible.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon. I'm a celebrant, I'm a death educator, and I'm also an end-of-life planning facilitator. And what I'm going to talk about today is the overlooked cost of a funeral. Many of my colleagues have mentioned the cost of a funeral in monetary terms, but what's often overlooked is the actual emotional aspects of not being prepared. So like other speakers have echoed, being prepared is absolutely paramount. It not only reduces the impact on those that are dealing with the funeral, the loved ones that are left behind, but there are so many other areas that it can impact emotionally, which can impact financially. And what I mean by that is that we are many different people to many different people. It's often a combination. This can result in people feeling unheard because they feel that it should go one way or it should go another way. And that unfortunately can lead to mental health, depression, and it can impact on the grieving process itself. So early intervention would be my definite advice here. Listening to the other colleagues, shopping around, that all deals with the financial, which is very important. But I feel it's also important to know what the loved one would have wanted, because without knowing that, it's the conflict I've already expressed, or it can be that the guilt of not knowing, did we actually honour that loved one's requests? So going back to said, yes, especially with what Greg was saying, there are things that you can do, whether that is having those discussions or whether it's speaking to someone life planning facilitator, where we can discuss what you'd like and how you would like that to actually occur. But starting those conversations are the most important things.
Sharon, I'm not sure if others are hearing you as well, but I know the connection seems to be flaky at your end, unfortunately. The last comment that I picked up was about the importance of having conversations with your loved ones. So I'm gonna go over to Paul McLean, if that's all right, and just really, Paul, wanting to pull on your expertise as a funeral director, and just recognizing some of the comments that have been made even earlier about sometimes perhaps how the issues around finance can be quite difficult and challenging for families to engage in. But my sense is that your experience again would be to encourage families to have those conversations early. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Are you able to hear me okay? Brilliant, fantastic.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Cassius. Thanks for inviting me on. Yes, I would certainly agree and concur with a lot that's been said today. I felt, Sophie, your presentation was excellent today. It really covered a lot of bases. And to hear from Maxine, who's a fellow FD, fellow funeral director, is always encouraging, because I think sometimes us at Integrity, our approach, we do sometimes feel that we are sort of a silent voice. And we are an independent, our competitors are often organizations or that have, we come across funeral directors who are running businesses that were set up by their grandparents, let's say. And so, these guys have been around the industry a lot, and a lot of them don't like the approach that we bring, because I think what you're finding, and Maxine touched on this, is that today people are a lot more savvy with their finances. They have to be. We're in a cost of living crisis. It seems to cost more to die than it is to live. And as a result of that, people are shopping around. A couple of points that I'd just like to raise briefly. And one of them, the first one is what Greg touched on today, and that's really about the preparation for funerals. Now, a lot of us who are still alive and kicking today have, for whatever reason, refused to look at a provision for funeral. A lot of us feel that by having a pension, a life insurance policy, and possibly a funeral plan, which I won't go into today because that will take another length of time. I have a view that is probably very different to most people on those, but a lot of people feel that what they already have in place is sufficient. But what is important, that everybody really takes a look at what they want their funeral to look like, how they want to be represented. And also, if you have elderly folk within your family, getting their wishes from them. And I know Greg touched on that with the My Funeral Wishes document from Dying Matters. It's something that we have done ourselves. And on our website, we have a final wishes document where we encourage folks to really document what they want their own funeral to look like, and to then go away and do a cost analysis on that. Now, as a funeral director, we often find, especially in the realm of a burial, if we are invoicing a client for funeral services, often up to 50% or sometimes more of that are fees that relate nothing to do with us. We simply capture them and pass them on. And that could be the costs for the cremation, the burial, the celebrant's fee, whatever it may be. A large chunk of that invoice value are just us capturing it from the client and passing it on. And funeral directors' fees are really split into three areas. One is the fee that the funeral director charges for his or her services, and that's what Sophie touched on today. So we have a standardized price list that is supposed to produce more transparency. I do have an issue with that, purely because some of the strands or the elements of service that we provide will never be captured in a standardized price list. So we are able to help families, especially from the Caribbean community, put on something called a 9-night. That is never going to be listed on a standardized price list. Okay, so that's the first thing, the funeral director's fee. The second element of those costs are what we call disbursements. So that's what I mentioned before. These are fees for other services not necessarily provided for by the funeral director, but arranged by the funeral director, and are simply captured on an invoice and passed on to the relevant service provider. And the other element of the fee, the third section, is what we call the ancillaries fees. So this is when you make a funeral bespoke to your wishes, whether it be you want limousines, a particular casket or hearse, casket or a coffin, order a service booklet, floral tributes, whatever you want to make that funeral more bespoke to you. These are what we call ancillary costs. And if we are able, whilst we're alive, to sort of do a cost analysis on those three areas, that will save a lot of the heartache and pain at the point of you passing for your family. Now, Sophie mentioned CMA regulation, and as a funeral director, we now need to be transparent by producing this standardized price list. I think it was September of last year. We all had to run around, speak to our printers, get the information to them, and produce this wonderful document that's one, I think it's maybe 2 clicks away, I'm not sure, I think you're right, Sophie, it's a click away from the homepage and displayed on your premises. Now, what the CMA have failed to do is, whilst they have tackled the issue of funeral directors being more transparent, and this is a bit of an internal fight that I think I'm having, but they have not addressed the cost behind the cemetery fees that are being charged currently. Now, there is an issue, and we highlight this from the outset with families, is what we call the residency rule. Now, as a funeral director delivering funerals anywhere within Greater London, we often have families who have a loved one who may be being looked after in a care home, say in the borough of Greenwich, but their actual place of birth or their home is in a completely different borough. Now, because they're paying council tax in a different borough, we always have to juggle with effectively 2 price lists, a discounted price for a resident and a non-discounted price for a non-resident. And that often trips a lot of families up when they are deciding on which cemetery they would like their loved one to be buried at. And I would always advise families to be very, very aware of that rule. There's nothing we can do about it, I'm afraid. It's a fee that we simply capture as part of disbursements and pass them on back to the cemetery. But often families get tripped up by this rule. We believe the CMA need to look at that. How can it be that the same hole in a cemetery is being dug, that's being dug can cost twice the cost, okay, if the person is not a resident within that borough, and sometimes 3 times that cost, by the way, okay? How is that possible? So a lot more needs to be done, and I'm conscious of time, Cassie, so I will hand back in just a second, but we just need to be aware of that. I'm just gonna end by finally, my final point is on financial affairs. Again, often we have families that come to us who have no money, okay? But the person who had passed away has the money. Therein lies the challenge. What do you do if you need to bury dad, okay, and all the funds for dad's funeral are in his bank account and your name is not listed on? So I would urge families really just to put their affairs in order. If you are securing funds for your own funeral, make sure that your next of kin or your family have access to get to those funds, because the trauma that is caused by having funds locked away in a place that family don't know how to get access to or are not aware of can be immense, okay? And what we really want to be able to do is to help families celebrate their loved ones, but the added pressure of just organizing finances can really compound the problem when it comes to just saying goodbye to a loved one, okay? Cassius, I know I'm over time, okay? So hopefully I've given you something of value there, but I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
That's really excellent, Paul, and for all of you as speakers. It does feel as if this was only a part one, and we do need to do some more. The conversation has just started, but really appreciate all of what you have shared with us for this afternoon. We have the last couple of minutes, and what I wanted to do was give you each just a final opportunity, just one sentence that you would want to leave with people. And when I say a sentence, if you have to take a breath, then it's more than a sentence. So just a brief line, really in finishing up, just a closing statement for those who are watching either the recording or watching the session for today. So Sophie, firstly coming to you, just a sentence to sum up, one key piece of wisdom that you would like to leave with people.
I don't think there's one key piece of wisdom, but I want to echo the advice that all of my colleagues have given about thinking ahead, pre-planning, and considering the big picture in terms of finances and in terms of the emotional and psychological impacts. And I'm sorry, Cassius, that was a really long sentence.
It's all right, you did quite well. I think it was 2 breaths. Maxine.
You know this won't be a sentence. Prior to COVID, long before COVID, I ran these workshops. Let us talk about death. Yeah, or can we talk about death? Still do them. Went around the churches, did a few. People don't want to talk about death. It's taboo, although COVID has drawn us closer, yeah? In order to follow the advice of everything that has been said in terms of organisation, preparation and choice, we need to talk about death and become comfortable with the fact that if we live, we will die and pay taxes, yeah? But we need to become comfortable talking about death so that we can have these letter of wishes that Greg spoke about and the planning that Paul's spoken about, and take less pressure off of people like Sophie, because it is tough. It really is difficult. And Paul McLean knows what he's talking about in terms of the finance. 90% of my problems are not with the dead, but they're with the living and their money and their arguments and the last minute payments and the squabbling. It's very important. And thank you.
Thanks, Maxine. Greg, final comments from the beautiful Black Country?
Plan, record and communicate your wishes. Just simple as that.
Greg, top marks to you, my friend. Bless you. The best so far, even though it's all important. Sharon, glad to have you back with us. Just one final comment for those who are watching this, one key thing that you will take from this conversation.
Document the intricacies of what your wishes are.
Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, loud and clear, folks. The importance of noting down your wishes, really critical. And yeah, Paul, anything else that you would just like to say in closing?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. It's a message I like to get to everybody. Losing a loved one will probably be the most difficult phase of your life. But if you can prepare your loved ones for your passing, that eliminates or reduces certainly the level of grief that they will have to undertake.
Wow, bless you. I'm reminded in that comment of something that Sharon said earlier, that we've talked a lot around the final financial costs, rightly, as the focus for today, and really appreciate everything that has been shared. But yeah, not forgetting the emotional cost. And I recognize that personally. But also as a minister in wanting to trying to support families who are grieving. So I just want to finish up by thanking you all as contributors. Sophie Clarke from Down to Earth and the Fair Funerals Pledge, Maxine Edgar from BronzeAsh Funerals, Greg Southall from Dudley Council, Sharon Sinclair from Circle of Life Events, and also Paul McLean from Integrity Funeral Care. Thank you so much. And also for those who have joined us this afternoon, we appreciate you and Omar for helping us with the tech as always. We're really grateful. So God bless you and take care.